I want to introduce myself. I am Dr. Anita Black. I am an associate professor with Lincoln Memorial University in the criminal justice graduate program. I am the program director for the Masters of Science in Criminal Justice program that I have up on the screen. And if you see, you can go to the address, which actually is, if you, let's see, sorry. It's lmunet.edu/MSCJ. And here you can go see all that we offer within our program. We do have the dual degree that Dr. Atkins discussed earlier this morning with DSAL, with the Duncan School of Law. We do offer a couple different pathways, with a pathway to your PhD program, which is more research-based, one that's more applied criminal justice, and one that's more administrative, where we focus more on the leadership and administration within the criminal justice field. But I'm here today with honor to introduce our next speaker. Let me stop sharing. There we go. Our next speaker is Dr. Rhonda Angstrom. She is an assistant professor of criminology at Davis and Elkins College. She does have a PhD in criminology. She has more than 20 years of experience teaching higher education within the United States and abroad. Currently, she is, as I said, an assistant professor of criminology at Davis and Elkins College, where she teaches courses in juvenile justice, research methods, theory, victimology, and crime and social inequality. Previously, she instructed sociology and criminology courses at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, California University of Pennsylvania, Westmoreland County Community College, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Hebei University in Boding, China. Dr. Engstrom has presented her research at national and regional conferences, just recently at the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences conference in Vegas. She has published in the Journal of Crime and Delinquency. She has recently earned her PhD in criminology at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Her dissertation for her PhD program is entitled "The Impact of Juvenile Confinement on the Life Course Trajectories of Youth Aging Out of Foster Care." And that is a huge interest to me with being in the criminal justice area, as well as my focus is too on juvenile justice. So today, her speech is titled "The Foster Care to Prison Pipeline, Implications for Policy and Practice." So I'm going to hand over the camera and the mic to Dr. Engstrom.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Black. I appreciate it. And I am really looking forward to sharing something that is on my heart. Can you see that screen? Yeah, you can see it. It's something that I'm really passionate about, and that is the foster care to prison pipeline. So as Dr. Black mentioned, I did my research, my dissertation in this area, and I'm coming off of that and using that, incorporating that into this topic as well today. But you probably have heard about the school to prison pipeline. That has been out there for a long time. And more recently, this term, the foster care to prison pipeline, has been used to discuss the link and the connection between, let me make it big, sorry about that. This connection between the foster care system and the juvenile and the justice system, both juvenile justice and criminal justice systems. And so today, just kind of to tell you what I'm going to be sharing with you, just to give you an understanding of some of the definitions, what the foster care to prison pipeline is, and what we mean by crossover youth, which is a term that I'll discuss a little bit more, that relates to these youth who are caught up in the foster care to prison pipeline. And then I'm going to interject some key findings from my own research that relates to the topic. And then I want to talk about some policy implications. And I'll be happy to take questions and have a few remarks to close with. So the foster care to prison pipeline, really The first time that I believe it was used was in Loeb's article in Children, The Future of Children, when he was talking about Ian Wildman's article related to the fact that the foster care system is a feeder into the criminal justice system that contributes to racial disparities. The reason for this is that, as you'll see through my talk, Blacks are overrepresented or disproportionately represented in the foster care system. So the fact that so many come out of the foster care system into the justice system contributes to these racial disparities that we see in our juvenile justice system and into our adult criminal offending. And so Loeb kind of uses this term, and he says, and I think this is probably to sum up what the foster care to prison pipeline is. He says it's the foster care system channels children and adolescents into the justice system. And I think that word that channels it, as you'll see, is very accurate in terms of the number of foster youth who end up in the justice system. We refer to youth who are involved with both the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system as crossover youth. Another term that's used is dually involved youth. I'm going to usually use the crossover youth. So these are youth who have crossed over from the child welfare system into the juvenile justice system, and they're involved with both. So in terms of defining crossover youth are a distinct subset of youth who are most at risk for negative outcomes in adolescence and young adulthood. And they arguably are the most likely to lack social and family support systems necessarily to build resilience. And that was in an article written by Baglivio and colleagues. But they're this subset that are, I think it's good to understand that this is a very high risk group of individuals. As I mentioned, we often talk about the school to prison pipeline. Well, foster youth, just in the nature of being in foster care, often move schools. This contributes to that school to prison pipeline, their engagement in school. So it really intersects with that. And then I want to, I thought this quote by a lawyer who works with crossover youth does a good job of painting a picture of who these kids are. And he said, these kids don't vote. They are the throwaway kids. No one expends financial, emotional, or physical energy on them. If they had been given even a little bit of encouragement, they could do a lot. These are good kids who have had horrific upbringings. They don't expect a lot from themselves, and the way they are treated shows that no one else expects a lot from them. And I think that is a really good way to understand how the system relates to these kids. As I'll talk, sometimes foster youth are put into our juvenile detention centers not because they've actually committed a delinquent act, but because there's no other placement for them. And that's a sad reality. And of course, that's not always, but that's probably the worst of the worst cases. But as we talk about crossover youth, we have to understand that there's various ways that youth cross over into the justice system and that there's this intersection. So in most cases, youth will be first involved with the child welfare system and then involved in the juvenile justice system. In one study, they found that 92% of crossover youth had been arrested, or I'm sorry, I said that backwards, had been involved with the child welfare system before being arrested. So 92%. There's a couple pathways that this works. Pathway one is while under care and custody of child welfare system, the youth might commit a delinquent act. Okay, and now they're involved with both systems. There's also those youth who have a history with the child welfare system that then are later referred, when they're no longer under the care and custody of CPS, are referred for delinquency or arrested. And then the last pathway is those youth who commit a delinquent act And then their case is then referred to the child welfare system with concerns maybe related to child maltreatment in the home. But it's the child's problem behavior that gets them involved with the child welfare system. We also have to kind of look at this overarching theme from the literature, from the research. WIDM is kind of foundational in looking at this relationship between child maltreatment and juvenile delinquency. Her earliest study was 1989, and she found similar results, but the one that I'll cite from is English, WIDM, and Branford. And they found that abused and neglected children, and all of them had been involved with CPS. This is how WIDM, how the research was conducted, was through case files with child welfare system, that abused and neglected children were 4.8 times more likely to be arrested as juveniles, 2 times more likely to be arrested as an adult, and 3.1 times more likely to be arrested for a violent crime than matched controls. Okay, so this is a huge number, and it shows that those youth who have had this experience of child maltreatment are more likely to end up in the justice system. So when we talk about crossover youth, it's important to understand how many youth are involved in the foster care system. And if we look at the last information that we have out of the Department of Health and Human Services is from the end of the fiscal year 2020. And so there were, at that time, 407,493 children in foster care at that time. So that's a big number when we talk about the high risk that they have to be involved later in the justice system. 51% of those were female, 49% male. In terms of race, there's definitely this disproportionate number of Blacks. 43% were white, 23% Black, but that's much higher than the percentage that we have in the general population, which is about 13%. And then 22% were Hispanic, and then 8% were 2 or more races. And this slide just kind of shows, again, just this disproportionate amount and this disparity, racial disparity in the CPS. So if we looked at how many children are involved with the child welfare system in general, it's 13% of all US children. However, 21% of Black children are involved with CPS for maltreatment. And in terms of foster care placement, 6% of all US children are placed into foster care or at least have one experience with that, whereas 12% of Black US children have this experience. And so we can see that this disparity, when it's connected to this foster care to prison pipeline, being so much more likely to be in the justice system, how this can contribute to our racial disparities in the criminal justice system. So in terms of crossover youth, what are the numbers of those youth who are in the child welfare system who then engage in delinquency? Numbers have ranged from 9 to 29% of child welfare system to engage in delinquent behavior. However, and then another studies found that between 7 and 10% of youth who were in the care and supervision of child welfare system, if they're 7 years or older, will eventually cross over into the juvenile justice system. So, you know, when we talk about 400,000 or more kids in the foster care system and 10% are going to cross over into delinquency, we're talking about 40,000 children. And then that number, for those who are especially high risk of delinquency, that number jumps to close to 25%. I use, in my research, I use the National Youth in Transition database. This is a national data set, a national survey of youth who are transitioning out of foster care. So these are youth who at age 17 have not found a permanent placement, have not been adopted, and they're actually aging out of foster care. with the second cohort of that group, 33%, a third of them reported not just having been involved with the juvenile justice system, but actually having spent time in a correctional facility. So a third of the youth who are transitioning out of foster care have spent time in a juvenile correctional facility. And another thing to look at and consider when we talk about this foster care to prison pipeline is the fact that when we look at the juvenile justice system and how deeply involved, involvement goes from diversion to probation to placement into correctional facilities, that the percentage of crossover youth increases quite a bit. So if we looked at all diversion cases, about 1% of those are crossover youth. But if we go to probation cases, that percent rises to 7%. And for those who are actually placed into juvenile correctional facilities, the number is 42%. Another study, in Ohio study by Halemba and Lord, found that 45% of youth on probation had been reported to child welfare services. In other words, they were crossover youth. And in this number just kind of blows your mind, but in this one county that they looked at, 89% those incarcerated by the juvenile court had contact with the county's child service agency. So for those of us, we're not terribly surprised, but it's just very disheartening when we look at some of these numbers. So what else does the research tell us regarding the significance of the problem? These youth do have delinquency histories that are more extensive and serious than, of course, general probation population. But again, some of that could be from their own trauma, right? And it could be because they're more likely to be involved to begin with the juvenile justice system. But these youth, once they are in the system, they are at greater risk of reoffending than juveniles without maltreatment. Barrett and colleagues found that crossover youth were 2 times as likely to recidivate compared to other youth in the system. And we also know that crossover youth are detained more often and for longer periods compared to other youth who are in the juvenile justice system. Halemba and colleagues found that crossover youth are 2 times as likely to be committed to the Arizona Department of Juvenile Corrections, in other words, placed, than those who were delinquency only juveniles who were on probation supervision. So even among youth who are in the system, crossover youth, those who have a history of child welfare involvement, have a higher likelihood of being placed and going deeper into the system. So who are the dually involved youth, or probably should change that to crossover youth, but demographics, there's a higher proportion of Blacks who are crossover youth. Crossover youth tend to be younger at the age of first arrest compared to other youth in the juvenile justice system, and they tend to have higher rates of poverty, come out of poverty, which is not a surprise. Individual characteristics, there are high rates of mental health problems among crossover youth, high rates of substance abuse. I have a couple slides on some of this. Problematic family history, which includes exposure to domestic violence, criminal offending of parents, alcohol and drug use of parents. And then there's school problems and academic failure. So again, disengagement from school, which could lead to other problems like truancy and status offenses that go into the school to prison pipeline. And so there's definitely this connection. As far as child welfare experiences, most of these children are going to have a prior history of parental maltreatment. Those who are placed in group homes are more likely to get involved in the juvenile justice system. And those who have a lot of multiple placements are going to be more likely to be crossover youth, to be also involved with the juvenile justice system. There's some gender differences that I think are important to consider in terms of crossover youth. As with other populations of the juvenile system, more crossover youth are male. About 2/3 of crossover youth are male, and that's from several studies. However, for females, they actually represent a larger proportion of dually involved or crossover population compared to the general delinquency population. So it goes from about 23% of females involved with the juvenile delinquency system to over, I think it's like 36% who are actually, when we look at just crossover youth, 36% of them are females. So there have a higher percentage of those involved in this. And also female crossover youth have been found to have similar levels of offending and reoffending as male non-crossover youth. So females tend to not offend as often and not reoffend as often, however, as males. However, when it comes to the crossover youth, the females are more similar in their rates as non-crossover male youth. So hopefully that makes sense, but it is an interesting fact when we consider that this child maltreatment and this involvement with CPS may have a disproportionate impact on females. In terms of racial disparity, which I've already mentioned some in terms of foster care, one study found that those who are crossover youth in LA were disproportionately at a rate of 6 times their general population numbers. So crossover youth was much higher. And this is just an indication that these youth are more likely to be in the child welfare system, and that this continues to contribute, as I've been saying, to the racial disparities that we see in juvenile justice and then continuing into our adult criminal system. And I think it's important to look at the high rates of mental health. We talk a lot about the importance of understanding mental health and substance abuse. And some studies kind of varied, but studies have ranged, mental health among crossover youth has ranged from 59% to 76%. And I thought it was really interesting that in a pretty recent study, 25% were actually of crossover youth were prescribed psychotropic medications. And we, these are serious, right, drugs. And so that's a big number. So in terms of substance use, it's been quite a variation. It probably depends on how it's actually been defined, but it's ranged from 80% in 2 studies to 19% in another study. In the NYTD data that I used, 23% of youth at age 17 had a substance abuse referral. Okay, so this goes beyond, just self-reporting substance abuse to actually having someone refer them for substance abuse treatment. And so about a quarter of the youth that are transitioning out of care have had a substance abuse referral. I sort of mentioned that, we need to also consider their experience within the foster care system, and that placement, that multiple placements being moved over and over again can be problematic. So placement changes have been shown to be harmful for youth behavioral health outcomes. Being moved from a home in itself can be a traumatic experience for a youth. So these are often youth who have already had various forms of trauma in their life, from child maltreatment to neglect, to poverty, and then to also be moved, right? So that becomes another source of trauma. What studies have shown in relation to delinquency is that youth who have 4 or more placements were more likely to engage in delinquency relative compared to youth who only had 3 or fewer placements. In the study I used using NYTD data, the National Youth in Transition data set, those who had not been confined as juveniles had on average 4.73 placements, and those who had been confined in a correctional facility had a mean of 5.89 placements. Now, if we compare that to Ryan, this, by the way, difference was not significant. However, if you compare it to Ryan, you see that all of them had over 4 placements. So their risk of delinquency was already pretty high. Placement instability has been linked in some studies to criminal offending in adulthood. So trying to have our youth, give them permanency can be one of the things that we need to really look at and work on this movement as well to keep them in the same home. So this study our slide really just shows kind of some general understanding of the foster care to prison pipeline. When we compare crossover youth, or I'm sorry, former foster youth to the general population, they are more likely to have been adjudicated delinquent. They're more likely, they have higher rates of being convicted of a felony after age 21. They have higher rates of arrest, and that ranges from 1/3 to 1/2 in a systematic review by Stott and Gustafson. And they have higher rates of being incarcerated as adults. And so consistently, the research shows that being in foster care is a risk, and this really supports this idea of the foster care to prison pipeline. And I like this, looking at this slide from Byrne et al., because they actually compared percent of crossover youth that had gone to jail after 4 years of exiting the juvenile system to those with only juvenile involvement and those with only foster care. And they found that about 2/3 of crossover youth had a jail stay within 4 years of exiting the juvenile system. And that compares to slightly half of those who were juvenile probation only youth, and about 25% of former foster care only youth. And in terms of other negative outcomes for foster youth, we can't forget that it all comes about, right? That there's a lot of negative young adult outcomes. So those youth who have aged out of foster care, they're less likely to graduate high school or obtain a GED. They're less likely than the general population to attend college. They're less likely to succeed in college. About 23% of the general population graduates college. Only 3% of foster youth who attend college actually graduate. They're also less likely, studies show, to be employed and to be employed full-time. In addition to this, foster youth who are aging out of care have higher mortality. Their mortality actually increases. Their higher rates of substance use. They have higher rates of homelessness as well. Homelessness is another big problem among youth who are aging out of care. So I just wanted to put this slide up. It relates to some of my study in relation to, if we look at this educational attainment, if educational attainment and employment has been shown to be positive turning points for individuals who've been involved with the juvenile justice system. And so we see in the general population that there's this negative relationship between graduating high school and criminal offending. Those who graduate high school are less likely to engage in criminal offending in adulthood. Graduating high school also has been shown to mediate the delinquency, the juvenile delinquency and criminal offending. So those who graduate high school and have been delinquent in the past, that just graduating high school reduces that link between juvenile delinquency and adult criminal offending. College enrollment has also been shown to be this turning point where those who've been enrolled in college, there's only one study that actually showed this. Walter's the only one who really looked at this until, I guess, my research looked at this. But college enrollment was found to be a turning point in the life course of juvenile offenders. That those who enrolled in college were less likely to continue offending in adulthood. In other words, they were more likely to desist. Both graduating high school and full-time employment have also been shown to be turning points among a sample of maltreated children. And this was another of Kathy Whittam studies, Allwood and Whittam, looking at graduating high school and employment as turning points. And so I'm going to kind of transition a little bit to discuss my study, and I'm not going to share with you the whole methodology, but I just wanted to give you an overview of where the data, secondary data came from. And so the data is the NYT, the National Youth in Transition Database, is administered through the Administration for Families and Children. This is a self-reported demographic and outcome information that comes from foster youth. So I was looking specifically at the outcomes file. And so this outcome component was collected in 3 waves. First, when youth were 17 and in foster care. The second wave at age 19, and then the third wave when the youth were 21. The study that I use is a second cohort of the NYT data, TD data. The baseline data was collected in 2014, and the third wave then was in 2018. One advantage of this data set is that it can be linked to the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System, or AFCARS, which provides information on foster care experiences like age of placement, number of placements, these types of things. So just to give you an overview of the sample, there was a total. So in my sample, I looked at only those who had responded to some of the key questions that I was interested in on all 3 waves of data. So there was some attrition. So you can see that the males were 43% and females 57%. So there was some attrition in terms of the males who responded. And this also relates to an attrition in those who had been confined as juveniles. As terms of race and ethnicity, 41% were non-Hispanic white, 27% were non-Hispanic Black, and 21% were Hispanic of any race. I wanted to share with you just some of these key study variables because it relates to some of the other statistics that we've been looking at in terms of crossover youth. So for foster youth, about 25%, once we got through this, as I said, 33% at the first baseline data, but there was some attrition in those who had been confined as juveniles. This was a question where they were asked, did you spend time in a correctional facility? Okay, so the same question at each wave of data. The first one at 17, they were asked, have you ever spent time in a correctional facility? And then the follow-up years, it was in the last 2 years, did you spend time in a correctional facility? So 25% of the full sample had been confined as juveniles, so about a quarter, and that went up to about 33% of the males in the sample, and just under 20% of females. Of those who were then incarcerated age 19 to 21, there was 17% of the full sample were incarcerated age 19 to 21. That was 11% of the females and about a quarter of the males. And you can see in terms of getting a high school diploma by age 19, that was about 2/3. And about 25% were enrolled in college at age 19. And this actually should say probably enrolled in high school was about 25. And then about a third of the females and just over a quarter of the males were enrolled in post-secondary education at age 19. And this included any type of education. So it didn't necessarily, but it had to be after they had graduated. As far as employment, about 2/3 of those who were unemployed, about 2/3 of the sample, were unemployed at age 19. So these mediating variables that I'm looking at in education and employment, these were coming from the second wave of data. So to do the temper ordering of it, these mediating variables came at age 19. And then NEAT refers to, it's kind of a neat variable, but it says not engaged, not employed or enrolled in education or training. So not employed or enrolled in education. You can kind of simplify it that way. So neither employed or in education at age 19. And that was about a quarter of them were neither in education or employed at age 19. And then of the sample, another mediating variable that was included because of the incarceration was being incarcerated age 17 to 19. And that was close to a quarter of the males and overall about 17% of the sample. So the key finding that I was interested in was this impact among foster youth. What does juvenile confinement, spending time in a correctional facility, how does that impact later adult offending or young adult offending? And so controlling for a number of variables, juvenile confinement was significantly related to incarceration age 19 to 21 for the full sample. And then I also looked at it for males and females and males separately. And for both of those groups, it was as well. So the fact that a youth does end up being confined as a foster youth, they're already at risk, right? But then to be confined increases that risk of future offending. So some of the other findings, juvenile confinement was found to decrease the likelihood of high school enrollment and post-secondary enrollment at age 19 for the full sample and for females, but not for males. So juvenile confinement actually did not have a significant relationship after controlling for all the other variables. For males, juvenile confinement significantly increased the likelihood of being NEET, again, not engaged, not employed or engaged in education at age 19. And that again was for the full sample and for females, but was not true for males. Juvenile confinement significantly increased the likelihood of incarceration age 17 to 19. So those intermediate years, and that was the strongest relationship. So this has something to do, this implies looking at reentry of juveniles because if they're again put into the system at between 17 and 19 and they reoffend, then, there's a strong relationship there. And then the full sample in females, educational enrollment and being NEET were mediators between juvenile confinement and incarceration age 19 to 21. So that those who were enrolled, even if they had juvenile confinement, were less likely to offend in a young adulthood, or if they were not, if they were not NEET, if they had either had education or employed at age 19, they were less likely to offend. But for all groups, that incarceration age 17 to 19 was the biggest mediator. So what we do also know, however, is that when we look simply at the relationship between some of these variables and offending 19 to 21, high school, graduating high school and educational enrollment in the full model did reduce the likelihood of incarceration age 19 to 21, and being NEET, which is the negative, right, end of that, remained a significant predictor of incarceration age 19 to 21. But again, being incarcerated at age 17 to 19 was the largest predictor. And I wanted to point out some other key findings. Being Black remained a significant predictor of incarceration age 19 to 21 for males, not for females. But race definitely had an impact as a predictor of likelihood of incarceration age 19 to 21, and that's after all the other controls and all the other mediators. Being in extended foster care was actually shown to decrease the likelihood of incarceration for males. And then ever having a substance abuse referral significantly increased the likelihood of incarceration age 19 to 21. So, and then homelessness also increased the likelihood of incarceration age 19 to 21. So that just indicates that we need to look at substance abuse treatment. We need to consider housing for these youth. So probably don't have quite enough time to go through spend as much time on the implications as I'd like. But I think this is an interesting thing in terms of prevention recommendations. And this comes from former foster youth. And they suggest providing trauma-informed practices from the day youth enter foster care. And I'm going to repeat trauma-informed practices over and over again at every step of the way. But from the day that youth enter foster care, providing trauma-informed treatment and practices, avoiding punitive actions, which apparently we're not doing a very good job of that. And that's why we have this foster care to prison pipeline. Giving youth a voice in decisions. One researcher had found that just having special legal counsel for these youth who are coming dually involved really enabled them to have that voice and to change the sentencing outcomes. And I mentioned that sometimes youth are placed into detention centers simply because there's no other foster care placement. And so we need to refrain from doing that. There has to be other options. And then we need to employ diversion strategies for status offenses. And at the same rate, at least, that we do for other youth, right? Because it seems to be higher for those who have child welfare involvement. And some general implications when we talk about crossover youth is just a greater awareness of the foster care to prison pipeline. One of the ways that we can implications is really to coordinate services between child welfare system and the juvenile justice system, the family, whatever other systems are involved. One example is the crossover youth practice model. And this has been instituted in 23 states, and that number is probably a little outdated, so it might have been expanded. But it's a great model to look at of coordinating services, collaborating to put the interests of the youth first and forefront. And again, I can't leave out the trauma-informed programs and practices. In terms of youth that are aging out of care, which my study specifically looked at these youth who are aging out of care, there needs to be this understanding that as foster youth age out of care, that these are critical years for them. And so in relation to that, we need to consider transitional programs. We need to fund transitional programs for foster youth, housing, education, employment, treatment, substance abuse treatment. We need to have opportunities for them. We need to expand independent living services. As part of my research, I had a qualitative component as well. And I talked to former foster youth who are now undergraduates. And several of them talked about their independent living counselor being one of their biggest supporters. We need to also encourage youth to enter extended foster care. We need to promote this idea that remaining, under, CPS can be a positive thing, as some of the findings in my research showed. And again, I can't leave out trauma-informed programs and practices, and then mentoring and support for youth who are transitioning out of foster care, and also for those enrolled in post-secondary education. Personal thing for me is just wanting to see foster care alumni programs, which are expanding, but to see them at every institution of higher education. I think this is like my last slide, so I'm going to go ahead and go through it, and but I am just about done. Just the implication for reentry. As I mentioned, those ages 17 to 19 and the link between juvenile confinement and then incarceration, age 17 to 19, suggests that many of these youth are re-entering the system, and that really keeps them on this path of offending, right? So we need to figure out ways to disrupt this, as we talk about it with the school to prison pipeline, to disrupt this pipeline, to change it, to redirect these youth. And so there's implications here for reentry. Some of the recent research has suggested that reentry plans need to be collaborative, right? They need to be holistic, include housing plans, education plans, all of these things, and they need to be strengths-based. These youth who do well, the youth who I talked to who were in college, are showing resiliency, right? And so focus on their strengths to encourage their resiliency. And then these reentry plans need to be trauma-informed. And I wanted to include a few, from the research, what do we know has been And we know that multi-systemic therapy has been effective, family functional therapy, as well as treatment foster care, which relates directly to the foster care to prison pipeline. And that's really what I have for you today. Just some things with future research is just more research in this area to understand, again, how we get youth off of this pipeline, how we disrupt it, how we, change their path. And then kind of my own thing is just understanding that those that are in our justice system, so many of them have trauma, so many of them have these horrific upbringings, right? And to include understanding of that when we think about youth and even adults who are involved in our justice system. Okay, and there's a few chat questions, but I am.
Hey, Dr. Engstrom, I'll read them out to you, if that's okay.
Okay, that sounds good.
And that was wonderful. I just want to say that I have seen a number of those issues that you introduced. But the first question is, do you think addressing the mental health issues at an early age may reduce the number of crossover youth?
I definitely think. I think that's one of the recommendations at the end. And I saw that question a little bit earlier. But yeah, the foster youth themselves, right? That policy that council that I talked about, these are foster youth saying, use trauma-informed care from an early age, right? I think dealing with that, trying to address those mental health needs at an early age is really very important.
I agree. Do you think does it matter the age with which a child enters the foster care system?
Age tends to have some impact, and it usually the research suggests the older age. However, after controlling, and I had a lot of demographic factors, I had a lot of other foster care experiences in my own research with this large data, sample. There was no connection between age of placement and later. However, my age I'm not sure what it is. I didn't pull that up, but it may have been older because these, again, are youth who never were permanently placed. So youth who enter at an earlier age tend to be more likely to be placed permanently, which, so that could explain why that older age at placement is going to lead more likely to juvenile, right? Because they will not have the permanency.
I agree. What other options do you see instead of centers when foster families are not available?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's probably the issue, is that there's not a lot. And I think that goes to just creating this understanding. One of the things that was very interesting in my qualitative part was I had at least 3, maybe more, maybe most, when it really came down to it, that their turning point and what put them on a path to go into college came about very late in their adolescence. And how often we have this mindset that we can only help really young kids, that there's some point in adolescence that we can't that they're somehow lost. And yet at least 3 that I can think of specifically said they were 17, they were juniors in high school when they were taken out of their home. 2 of them were actually, that was the first time they were placed. They were placed with best friends' families, and it completely changed their life. One of them specifically had been getting in trouble in school. Her house was so chaotic. She would go to school, she would go to the auditorium, she would sleep, and then she would end up being late for school. And not only was she getting late and tardiness and truancy, but she was also getting into fights. So she was not actually ever involved with the juvenile justice system, but she was definitely on that pathway, right? So I think we need to understand that late in adolescence, that there can be a change that can really impact these youth. So encouraging more foster families, an understanding of treatment foster care. I think we need to understand that these can be saved so much in terms of trauma for the youth and provide them a stable home, but also save in costs like for society in terms of future offending. So there's not any easy answer. We need more options. We need an understanding of the good that you can do through foster care and more families maybe to see that. there's not an easy answer because sometimes it is the only placement, right? And so.
Let's see, another question. Have you looked at the reason when you're looking at the crossover youth and all your statistics, have you looked at the reason that a child went to foster care? For instance, did they go for neglected youth versus delinquent youth?
Yeah, so as I said, one of the studies looked at that 92% of those who were in the juvenile justice system had actually been involved with the child welfare system first. So a large number have been involved. Overwhelmingly, those youth who are involved with the child welfare system, the reason is child maltreatment. Mm-hmm. In my own study, I was able to control for reason, and I did that to some extent. So I had reasons for removal, and one of them was removed for child behavior problem, because you're right. And I had one of my qualitative participants who talked about how she seemed to have a stable home, but she had gotten in trouble, right, herself. And through that, her parents were dragged in. So there's definitely that. And I honestly think that we need to have more research on that, because there definitely was a connection in my, before I did all the controls, right? Being removed for a child behavior problem definitely did connect to delinquency. But again, why do children misbehave? Sometimes it's because of their trauma, whether it's known or not. So that also in itself can have things, but yeah. But that's definitely an area of research.
Okay, and there is a comment by Ms. Brown that there needs to be more diversity amongst the decision makers. More attention should be paid to individual biases. There is an elephant that is not being addressed, and find this to also be the case in the law school area.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's no explanation for the racial disparity that we see other than the system is, there's systemic bias there. And the fact that so many are involved with CPS, that comes out of poverty. Sometimes this confounding, right, neglect and poverty can end up putting a child into the child welfare system, because, the poverty, it looks like neglect. And so I think that's another, part of that systemic racism that comes about too.
Okay, and I missed one, but here's another question. And you're going to have to help me with your name, Ibrahim Jobata, that he's from Gambia. Does underrepresentation lead to high crime?
So underrepresentation, like of the, not crazy.
No, let's see if you can add something to that. What do you mean by underrepresentation?
Here, maybe he's speaking.
You can't. Let's see.
In other words, not having power. I think like not having a voice. I think, yeah, I mean, I think in all terms, right? And even the foster youth were saying we need a bigger voice in our own thing. So whether it be because of race, whether it be because you're in foster care, to have that, and maybe it means legal representation, because I know there's some law people here, legal representation. And what is being advocated for among some of these groups is special counsel for these crossover youth. So they had someone who can advocate for them, and so they can have a greater voice in their own legal representation. So that may be.
He may have stepped away. Okay, well, let's see, let me check.
One more, I think.
Oh, do you see it? I see that down there in Q&A, but I think it's the same one.
According to National, more than 80% of social workers are white. These are the same social workers that work to criminalize poverty. In many states, social workers do not have to be licensed unless they have no skin in the game. There needs to be more oversight. Yeah, I think there's definitely this. I recently had a CASA worker, was having a conversation with her. And of course, we have high rates of poverty, not necessarily racial diversity, but we have high rates of poverty in West Virginia, where I am. And she's coming from that. A CASA is a court-appointed special advocate, which I think more of those is also needed. Those are they do give the voice to the youth, and several of the foster care youth that I spoke to really appreciated the CASA workers who do kind of hear from them and kind of that mediator between the youth and the social worker. So that may be one thing that can help. But yeah, she talked about this confounding, right, poverty and neglect, because you see the kids, there's no money to have certain things or to even have food. And then that becomes conflated with the idea that you're being neglectful as a parent, when actually it has to do with their own state, which if they had, you know, systems in place to support them and to help their children, you know, this neglect would not be an issue. So I think maybe that is part of that. You're muted, Anita.
Thank you. Looks like I don't see any more questions. Any last minute questions? Okay. Well, next, would you tell us where we can find more information on your material?
So yeah, I'm actually going to be publishing my dissertation soon, and hopefully getting some other things published too in the future out of this. But I will, I don't have the references on this PowerPoint, but I can get that maybe out to you too.
That would be great. Thank you. We appreciate you. Thank you. It was very, very informative.
Good. I'm glad. I would appreciate being here. And like I said, this is a topic that, you know, I feel really passionate about, and to make people just to understand where these youth are coming from. Should end with one caveat here, and that is that there's some children who are never involved with children and youth services who end up with, who have experienced abuse. And in some cases, the research has suggested that they actually have worse outcomes just from the child maltreatment. So just kind of end with that caveat. I actually had a student who wanted to share his story of pretty horrific abuse from his mother in a class this morning. And when CPS came out, they never really saw anything. And yeah, so yeah, just kind of a caveat that, you know, child maltreatment in general, it's easier to look at foster care youth because there's this history, right? And we can look at their cases. It's harder to really understand those who have simply had child maltreatment and that maybe has never been identified or reported, right? That also can lead to delinquency. So it's that trauma. It's the trauma.
I agree. I've seen it. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody that has attended. Just want to let everybody